This is Apologetics Live. To answer your questions, your host from Striving for Eternity Ministries, Andrew Rappaport.
All right, we are live, Apologetics Live. Glad you're with us on another Thursday night. Yes, I'm actually here starting the show for once. It's been a while. I'll start making my way back in slowly, as I know Anthony and Justin have been doing a wonderful job. I hope you guys have been enjoying the variety of shows. We have a very good show for you tonight. As those who are watching, you can see in the scrolling bar that Justin put up, Creation versus Evolution with Call Me Emo and the crew. But I'll let Anthony explain how that. And Call Me Emo is the tag name of the gentleman who's going to be in with us, Mikie. He and Anthony we're going to start off first with a discussion there, and I hope that it'll be a good discussion. Basically, creation versus evolution, some things there. And what I want to do, I'm going to bring in Dr. Anthony Silvestro and Justin, our other co-hosts here. So, guys, first off, I want to thank you guys. Since I'm going to start off the show, I want to thank you guys for the past couple weeks and doing the show in my behalf, as I've been kind of moving and packing and unpacking and a lot of craziness. I want to take a time to do two things. One, I want to give a little bit of an update where I'm at and what's been happening and why I've been kind of so distant. I'm not dying or anything like that, as one person wanted to know because I wasn't on the show. The thought was I'm actually in the hospital with cancer. That was what some person came up with. I was thinking, my response was, I think that Dr. Silvestro would have let people know to pray for me if that was the case. But no, I moved out to Pennsylvania, as many know, to start a church with three other families. And we are, we basically had someone that we did have as a pastor, and he has disqualified himself and left. And I have taken over really the responsibility of the pulpit, which is why I haven't been able to have the time to do some of these shows, because I'm preaching every week and preparing messages, along with trying to do what I can with Striving for Eternity, doing that full time. So it's been quite busy, and so I do appreciate your prayers. Donald Jacks wants to know if I lost my salvation. That was his argument. Okay, so leave it to Donnie.
Yeah.
Here's what I'd like to do, and I want to do this. This is something more for folks. I want to start bringing some apologetics into the show more, not just displaying apologetics when we have discussions, but different things. And one thing I want to do is bring up a term. Maybe some of you didn't hear. I went over this with Anthony, and it is a term called sea lioning. Now, maybe you guys don't know that term. The term it showed up actually for the first time that I saw in 2016, 4 years ago, in the Urban Dictionary. Let me read to you what this is. And this is, I'm doing this because there's two things. One, with this term, I've seen a change of the term, the way it's being used, and it's very interesting the way that's being used. It's not being used right, but it's a term that, for many of us who are do apologetics, we would see this term as something that people often do to us, and now people are trying to use it against us. So let me go through. Sea lining is this. Let me give you the definition from the Urban Dictionary: a subtle form of trolling involving bad faith questions. You disingenuously frame your conversation as sincere, requesting to be enlightened, placing the burden of educating you entirely on the other party. If your bait is successful, the other party may engage painstakingly, laying out their logic and evidence in the false hope of helping someone learn. In fact, you are attempting to harass or waste the time of the other party, and have no intention of truly entertaining their point of view. Instead, you react only to each piece of information by misrepresenting it or requesting further clarification ad nauseum. And so the name sea lioning came from some Wondermark comic strip. Now, I see this a lot on the street. We actually, Anthony and I have a term for this, and this is called time waster. And so we will see this on the street where someone will just ask question after question after question after question, and they really don't care the answer. And we've gotten into a habit when we see someone like this that we'll ask the question, do you really want an answer? It is a funny thing when you ask that question, because you'll often get people like, no. And if someone asks me a question, they don't care about the answer, I just move on. There's no sense in discussing that any further. Anthony, it looked like you were going to say something. No. So here's what I see. If you want a great example of sea lioning, watch Matt Dillahunty debate almost any Christian. I say almost because a couple years ago we set up a debate, Matt Slick, Matt Dillahunty, and one of the things that we required, we being Matt Slick and I, when we were discussing this, we said that Matt was only going to do this debate if Dillahunty took a pro position in the debate. In other words, he had to actually defend something. It was very interesting because by the time I got to Q&A, he actually admitted, because he started off saying, this is great. It's the first time I get to defend something. I always have to, attack someone else's view, but, I'm really looking forward to this. And when we got to Q&A, he completely bailed. He admitted, this is hard, like having to actually defend what you're saying when someone's asking you for evidence and things. And so he immediately bailed and wanted to leave the debate style for discussion style, which Matt agreed to. But then on Matt Dillahunty's show, he actually tried to say that Matt Slick somehow was the one not following the format. And it's like, well, if you watch the debate, you actually see Matt Dillahunty asked for it, but Matt Dillahunty does the sea lioning quite a bit, along with many others. Here's the change of the term. Now, if you go to Wikipedia, there's an update there, and it's changed. So sea lioning on Wikipedia says sea lioning is a type of trolling or harassment which consists of pursuing people with persistent requests for evidence or repeated questions while maintaining a pretense of civility and sincerity. And so the way that I became aware of this change was seeing someone using it on me, because what I was doing is they were making claims and they had no support for the claims. And I kept asking for evidence, and they said that I was sea lioning. And I said, no, I'm not, because I'm not asking meaningless questions just to harass. But now the way it's being used is if you actually ask someone for evidence, that's now being called sea lioning. So that's a changing of the definition. And I think it's being used now, I think, in a wrong way, which shouldn't surprise us because many things are being redefined and used wrongly, but with new definitions. So that's a term maybe some of you guys have known. Maybe I know Dr. Silvestro, you and I had talked earlier this week, and you had said you hadn't heard that term. You and I refer to it on the streets as a time waster. So I'm aware of it, but hadn't been aware until recently the change of meaning. But you'll often see this with people, especially if you're doing apologetics. You'll see people that will be sea lining you. They're just, they act like they're sincere. They act like they care about the answer to the question, but they really aren't. The way that I try to encourage you guys to deal with that is just say, do you really care for an answer? Anthony and I had gone out on the streets. We were at, actually, I think you weren't at the first Reason rally. I don't think you were there. So, Justin, I don't know if you went to the first one, but at the first
second.
You went second. Okay. So first Reason rally that we did, we actually would walk around and ask people if I had, because they would say, prove God exists. And we'd ask this question: if I gave you ample evidence to your satisfaction that God exists, would you worship him? And one after another at the Reason rally, they said no. And then I just move on, because now you're not going to be engaging in a rational discussion. It's more a religious discussion or just a debate for debate purposes. But it's not going to be a discussion. They're not interested, because you think about that question that I can convince you to your satisfaction. And people will be like, well, there is no evidence. No, if I can convince you to your satisfaction, whatever your satisfaction is. Now, we were in Seaside Heights, New Jersey. Anthony, I don't think you were out there back in those days with us, but we had a guy who said, if you can prove, if God could do a miracle, I'd believe it. I said, okay, define a miracle. He goes, sticks his hand out. If God puts a hamburger in my hand right now, I'll bow my knee and worship him. I said, what if God puts the money for a hamburger in your hand right now? Will you worship him? He goes, sure. So I just got off the preaching stool, slapped $5 in his hand and went, bow your knee. Of which, of course, he went, that wasn't a miracle. You did that. I said, God used me to do that. I said, a Jewish Christian giving away money, that's not a miracle? I let him define what the miracle is. But obviously, it's not a real miracle the way he was. But the reality is, even if he saw a miracle, like someone rising from the dead after 3 days, he won't be convinced. We know that in the first century, when God himself came to earth, was on a cross, dying, for our sin as a punishment for us, and he comes back to life, and the religious leaders still won't believe because their pride kept them from that. And so that's just something that I wanted to bring up in the first couple minutes, talk about sea lining. I'm going to try to do this a little bit more every once in a while, give you guys some new terms so you're familiar with it, and give you some practical, because that's really what this show is to give you guys practical apologetics. It's a live show, so we do want to invite anyone that wants to come on in and have discussion. With that, Anthony, I'm going to hand it off to you, so that you can introduce Mikie and bring him in, and I'm going to go backstage. I'll be listening off air for a while.
Yeah, absolutely. So Mikie, I'll bring you in just a moment. So the way this all started was I received an email. It was a couple of weeks ago, actually almost a month ago now. And it says this: Hi, Dr. Anthony Silvestro. I recently watched a debate you had on evolution and had a few questions I wanted to ask you in regards to plant kinds and macroevolution. And then he goes on. I don't want to take away any of his ammo tonight, but he went on to talk about why he believes in microevolution, how it must lead to macroevolution. And he wants to show us tonight, primarily by plants, and some animals, according to some of the articles he sent me. He wants to be able to prove his case. So this is what we're going to have a discussion on tonight. So it should be a lot of fun. And we do encourage anybody who's out there listening to come on in. If you're watching via YouTube, you can only ask questions in the comment bars. I'm seeing a ton of questions come up. If you want to ask live, you have to go on the StreamYard link, and you need to come into the show live, and then we will be able to answer your questions in that way. And questions can come either for Mikie or myself at that point. So having said that, we're going to bring in Mikie right now. Are you there, Mikie?
Oh, sure I am.
There we are. Good. So thanks for being on tonight. It was nice that you're able to kind of work this out in time.
I think he's on a motorcycle.
Sorry about that. Yeah. Let me just. It's a fan, though. All right, that's it. Yeah, sorry. You can repeat the question.
Oh no, I was just saying, how are you doing? I'm glad that we could get you on tonight. That we were able to make our times work to do this tonight.
Yeah, well, I'm doing all right. I mean, I guess we're all coping with the COVID-19 situation. We're still on some sort of a lockdown in Grenada. I'm not too sure how it is in America, but it's really bad here when it comes to like jobs and so on, because it's an island and it's kind of slow economically. Yeah. So that kind of COVID-19 thing really slows it down, because right now I am not really working, and you get like a stipend from the government, but it's like it's $300 EC dollars a month, and that's in US dollars, that's like $120 a month, and you have to make do with that. The only upside to it, living where I am, is that you don't necessarily have to buy much food, because you can get crops and so on. We kind of plant. Most people kind of plant their own food in that sense, so you can get food that way. You can go fishing in the river or whatever. So it's in terms of like food and so on, you won't really starve, but bills and so on, yeah, that's a problem.
Yeah. So, no, wonderful. Thank you for letting us know. So we've got somebody from long distance tonight. We thought Andrew is in the other side of the world, being from the New Jersey area, and now we got somebody from Grenada now. So cool. We're going to add in a couple other guys right now. So, Tom Bohm, we're gonna bring you in first. How are you doing tonight, Tom?
I am wonderful. Thank you.
Good to see you here. We're going to bring in our favorite chicken man,
The Cluck Commander.
Cluck Commander, who I'm guessing. Oh, there he is. He's there now. So, how are you doing, John?
I'm doing well.
At some point, you have to go outside and show us your chickens again. Every week, you have to do this.
All right. I'll have to maybe hop on my phone and
As long as you don't fall.
That's fine.
as long as I don't fall.
Either that or the chicken attacked you won. I mean, I'm trying to figure out which one that was.
So Justin, I don't know if you want to do it this way. We'll probably mute everybody else. We'll keep Michael and Andrew coming in the background for right now, and just so Mikie and I can just have a little bit of a discussion for even a few minutes, and then we'll start letting everybody else in so that we can go ahead with some questions.
Well, yeah. Why don't you two have your conversation for a while? And I mean, you know, if I've got a question or whatever. We'll just, if you don't mind, I'll throw something in the background and say hi.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I guess, Mikie, I want to give you a couple minutes to explain your position. You know, you obviously you disagreed with me and my arguments when it came to the debate that I had back several months ago. So I wanted to just have you just kind of come in and give us a few minutes of what you believe.
All right. So, well, the email I sent you was in regards to clarifying macroevolution, and more specifically is what exactly would constitute a macroevolutionary change, according to you. Well, biologists describe macroevolution as any change at or above the species level, but most creationists I know do not accept that definition. They would define macroevolution as a change in kind. Now, it's very difficult to know what that means because although there is a definition of a kind, the definition doesn't really have any application really, so we don't know exactly what a kind is or even what would constitute a kind, or even if we see a change in kind, how would we identify that? So I don't really know what that would look like. No creationists ever really say. Another thing is the where one tries to conflate macroevolution with universal common descent. So someone would say molecules to man or bacteria to biologists or whatever to say. That's more universal common descent. Yes, that would be a macroevolutionary event, but that's not macroevolution. Macroevolution is a certain amount of change, but where one lineage diverge into two lineages where they can no longer exchange genetic material successfully. And that's when you have like a new species, and that's a macroevolutionary event. You can have macroevolution independent of universal common descent. So you can have macroevolution and universal common descent can be false. But the thing is, I don't see the quarrel. I don't see why creationists don't want to accept macroevolution. Because macroevolution doesn't entail that universal common descent is true. It just shows that we can have micro variation and macro variation as well. So I'm just here to clarify what exactly would constitute a macroevolutionary change, or how do we distinguish a macroevolutionary change from the variation creationists already accept within kinds?
Yeah, those are great questions. So this is how I would answer you first. First and foremost, the reason why creationists have separated themselves from any ideas of what you're now, I want to make sure that we get some definitions correct, right? So, or at least so for the audience can understand the definitions, because you've already defined a few terms here, which I would define differently. So we have to backtrack just a little bit here so everybody knows where each of us are coming from. first of all, as a creationist would understand it, macroevolution, we would look at first of all variation with kinds, or variation within kinds. So there's a dog kind, there's a feline kind, there is a obviously humankind distinct, but there's different kinds of animals, and that never can one kind turn into another kind. Now, when you look at the king's kingdom, phylum, all the way down to genus and species, right? When you look at that classification system, we would say that is a secular type system that was built, and that kinds doesn't fit perfectly into that classification system. But we would still say that somewhere in the neighborhood of family is where we would put kinds. But we can't define it that way, because the way the definitions are from a secular perspective in that system is you're looking at common traits primarily, whereas that's not how we define a kind at all. The way we would define a kind is that if two animals can breed and have progeny, whether it's sterile or not is a different story. But if they can have progeny, we would say they're of the same created kind. If they can't, they're not. So we can take a house dog, any kind, and mate them with a wolf, and we'll get a baby dog of the dog kind. You can't do that if you mix a whale and a zebra, right? So I know it's kind of ridiculous, but that will never happen. So that's how we would define kinds first and foremost. Now, so to answer your second part of your question is, how will we define macroevolution and microevolution? Macroevolution now has to be, from a creationist perspective, one kind changing to another kind. We reject that completely. Why? Because it goes directly against the Bible. So I saw comments earlier in regards to that there are Christians who believe in evolution. They're inconsistent Christians who believe in evolution because they haven't been taught any better. They don't understand the foundation of what the Bible teaches, which, look, if you believe what the Bible says, you can't believe in billions of years, and you can't believe in macroevolution, because God clearly states he made everything to reproduce after its own kind. He does this 10 times at the beginning of Genesis. Where I think where our biggest difference would be is in microevolution. Now, in some ways, we would both accept a certain type of what you would define and what I would define as microevolution, which are minor changes or variations. I would define it as within a kind. I think your definition would be slightly different than that. But either way, you believe, and your email said this, and I'm sure you're going to dive into this a little bit more tonight. You believe that that microevolution over the long haul will eventually pile up enough variation to lead to a change in what we would consider a kind, but for you, what you would consider macroevolution, so that you can explain the single cell back billions of years ago that somehow magically came together in the dirt or pond scum, and that formed all the life we see today through these mechanisms. Whereas I would say that microevolution is real in the sense that for the genetic variability that's already built into that kind, sure, we can get lots of speciation out of it, but what you'll never have is a dog kind turning into a different kind. So that's how I would kind of start that part of it off. Does that help answer your questions?
Yeah, well, I do already understand what you mean by a kind. I mean, the definition you give, but it's the application of the definition. The creationist arguments themselves, the problem is not the arguments. The problem is the application of the argument. So usually a creationist arguments, the conclusions would follow from the premise. Totally sound argument, but they don't have any application in the real world. So, for example, you talk about kinds being able to interbreed, but I don't know how I apply that definition to plants, for example, to fossilized life forms. With creationists, for some reason, classify extinct life forms into kinds, even though they've never seen them interbreeding. How does that apply to organisms that are asexual? How does that apply to organisms with multiple sexes, and so on? So the definition, it makes sense, but it has no application in the real world. So what I'm trying to find out is, a definition that can be applied. So I understand that, usually when I talk to creationists, they would say that the ability to interbreed is an indication that two organisms are of the same kind. It's a strong indication. And I would agree with that. Okay, fine. It's a strong indication, but it's not the sole criteria by which kinds are defined, because as long as you have extinct life forms being included into extant life forms, or extinct life forms being classified amongst themselves, for example, with ceratopsians, for example. Ceratopsians, I think I did someone some, I forgot the clade, I forgot the name of the clade, but as long as you're classifying extinct life forms, then the definition of kinds being able to bring forth doesn't apply there, because we don't know that they bring forth. Instead, now we have to include comparative anatomy. This is what biomineralogy is all about, where they do a statistical analysis on the morphology, the general morphology on the organism. They do a little bit of genetics, but not much. It's more on the general morphology on the organism. So that's why you have, for example, Elephantidae, but extant elephants would be related to mastodons and the other, things. And you would have, for example, the extant sloth would be related to things like Megatherium, which is an extinct life form. So we can't know if they can interbreed. So the only how we know that is the only how biomineralogists can class them within the same kind is by using the similarities to class them, right? The same thing with humans and Neanderthals and Homo erectus. We've never seen them interbreeding, but the similarities alone is enough to warrant the relatedness. So we have to have a definition of a kind that would apply to extinct life forms, that would apply to asexual life forms and plants and so on, because the different criteria apply to how you guys classify life. So I agree that the ability to interbreed is a strong indication that two organisms are the same kind, but it's not the sole criteria.
Yeah. So you actually bring up a great point that we do need to discuss. And so when we as creationists are using kinds, as we have to discuss science, right? So science has to be something that is observable, testable, repeatable, verifiable, right? This is essentially the scientific method. So we can do this with any life that is alive today. So when we discuss kinds, we have to use what's alive today. When we are trying to go back in time, when we're trying to use fossils of extinct animals, we have another problem that comes into play, because we cannot use the scientific method. We can't use operational or experimental science now to actually figure out kinds. So we have to make our best guesses in terms of what is extinct. You're right, we have to do it by characteristics. What we can't do is say for certain what extinct animals are part of certain created kinds of today, but we can make some really good educated guesses. Now, that's where we stand. I would look at an evolutionist who has to make definitions. And let's be honest, you guys believe, and I'm assuming you believe, that this Earth has been around for billions of years, right?
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, yes, I do believe that the Earth is several billion years old. Correct.
Yeah. So that means then that for the science that you have right now on micro and macro evolution, you have literally less than 0.01% of the possible science you could do, because you can't do any actual experimental science on anything that is beyond what our capabilities are, right? Because we know that 99.99% of all what you would term species have become extinct up to this point. The difference is we would believe that they became extinct somewhere in the last 6,000 years. You would believe that it happened over the last several billion years. So that means that the experimental science that you use in order to make your definitions is only based on a very, very small segment of the entire life cycle of the Earth in your worldview. On top of that, you got another issue. Microevolution. Now, we can discuss this a little bit more tonight. I think this is a great topic, and it's a great topic for listeners to hear the differences, because we're using the same term, but we mean it very differently in some ways. But here's the thing. Have you or any other scientist ever observed an actual kind changing to another kind? Not that new species are coming about, right? This is, I would say that scientists, secular scientists, have been redefining terms for a long time right now. Just a few years ago, as we creationists would make an argument that we look at our fossil record and we see what you would call the Cambrian explosion, right? You would say that there was very simple organisms, then virtually there's like no intermediate fossils, and then all of a sudden we have all this complex life. All the intermediate fossils are literally missing. And you want to pick out, and I'm not saying you, but secular scientists want to pick out, well, we've got like 6 or 8 of these pre-human / ape things that we think are ancestors. And the reality is that between a chimpanzee and a human, or the common ancestor of a chimpanzee and a human, because there's literally 450 to 800 million base pair differences between them, our fossil record should have billions and billions and billions of intermediate fossils. They're not there. And so I bring all this up because the problem is we have secular scientists that have redefined intermediate fossils in regards to Cambrian explosion. They say, well, you know what? Every fossil is a transitional fossil. Completely bogus. This comes out of nowhere. And why? Is they're trying to answer the issue of literally nothing going from single simple cells in the fossil record to the complex organisms that we see scattered to the billions all over the surface of the earth. Well, I would submit to you that I think macroevolution has also been redefined. That macroevolution would be major changes. Now, I'm not saying that secular scientists have a good definition pinned down. I think creation scientists are much more honest in trying to come up with a definition that says a created kind, it would be 2 organisms that can reproduce and have progeny for what's alive. Like, that would be the best honest definition we could give you. But when it comes to a secular scientist, all we hear about evolution is change over time. We hear constant equivocation on the term evolution, where I hear microevolutionary evidence used for macroevolution. And then when it comes to macroevolution, you gave a definition earlier today that just said it's just a change from one species to another. And that was never the classic definition of macroevolution. Again, I don't subscribe to macroevolution, but that was not the definition for years. So that's where we have to really work through this tonight.
All right. So in regards to, you said that we're only working with like a fraction of a % of the data we have of animals alive today. It's not like if evolutionists are working with this data set, we're both working with the same data set. So it doesn't matter the age of the planet, we're still working with that same data set. Okay, so the age of the planet is irrelevant, whether or not animals are related or whatever, because we could have an event where God could have simply created some primordial single cell life form, and then by some mechanisms yet unexplained, diversify them into what we have today in a matter of thousands of years, because we can't put restrictions on the actions of an omnipotent being, right? So we can't put restrictions there, so I wouldn't even argue with that.
But you did. Okay, I'm sorry, go on.
No, sorry, go ahead.
I mean, you made a comment though, and as a creationist, if I heard you right, this is exactly what we would believe, is that God has pre-programmed within each kind of animal, within each kind of plant, he's pre-programmed lots of genetic information into that kind, to which you can speciate out, as we're learning in the fields of epigenetics right now, and something called a sensor theory, continuous environmental tracking, that's made popular by Randy Galuza about 5 years ago on ICR, that's through environmental factors by sensors within organisms, that genes can be turned off and on pretty quickly. Certain genes can be expressed and suppressed, and allow different characteristics to come forward, as well as speciation within a kind. So we would agree with all that can occur. I guess the difference, though, is that a creationist is going to say God pre-programmed that information ahead of time, whereas an evolutionist has to say that somehow, some way, new information has been injected into the genome, back from the original cell all the way up to the complex organisms today, like humans, that you had to have literally billions of bits of information added into the genome over time. And the only way you can get speciation with a secular evolutionist theory is that you have new information that becomes available through mutation and then somehow selected over time. Is that fair?
Right. That's fair enough. But let me just continue the point I was trying to make. So as I was saying, that there was no way we can place restrictions on the actions of an omnipotent being. So the question that would follow from that is, how do we identify the descendants of an original design? Now, I know creationists argue that kinds are things that can interbreed, but also things can diversify to the point where they can no longer interbreed, making, well, I don't know if it would be a new kind, but it's a new species that can no longer exchange genes. Now, this would also be possible under a creation model or an intelligent design model. There is nothing that says that can't happen. As a matter of fact, there's nothing that we could say can't happen under a creation model. So I don't see why creationists would argue that that can't happen. There's no reason why, for example, God couldn't have pre-programmed an original palm tree and then have all of them diversify into all the thousands of palm trees we have today, some of which can cross-pollinate and some of which can't. I don't know if that would constitute a new kind, because I don't know what a new kind is. I don't exactly know what a kind is. And how would you identify a new kind, even if it happened? Now, you're talking about the differences between humans and chimps in terms of the DNA bits, and you said that we would need millions of intermediates. I don't see why that's the case, because, for example, we have species of onions where one onion would have a genome size of about 6 billion base pairs, and its sister species would have a genome size of about 30 billion base pairs. That's because plants go through a thing called polyploidy, where they can duplicate their whole genomes. So the genomes just have in one generation, you go from 6 billion to about 12 billion, or maybe even more, because you can have multiple polyploidies in one generation. So you can go from 6 billion to 18 billion base pairs in one generation, because you're doubling your genome. So that there are mechanisms that do that. There are chromosomal duplications where you can have a chromosome that is 1 billion base pairs long, and you duplicate that so you have an extra billion base pairs. So I don't see why you would need millions and millions of intermediates for every single base pair, because organisms don't evolve base pair by base pair. They can evolve, you could literally add billions of base pairs in just one generation.
Yeah, here's the problem though. So I understand what you're saying here. So if I take a book, okay, and I put it on a copy machine and I copy the first 100 pages of that book, then I take the binding off the book and I add those 100 pages into the book. So now the book goes from 200 pages to 300 pages. But I literally just photocopied 100 pages and stuck that photocopy back into the book. Is that actually new information?
No, that's not new information. But here's the thing about the analogy. It's a bad analogy. Genes are not just words. Genes do biochemical functions. They produce proteins that do work.
I agree.
Instead, we can use a different analogy, and I would use one, but analogies are not supposed to be used in debates or discussions like this. When we talk about biology, we try to keep it to biology, because the analogies could kind of get it, too far off. So let's imagine you have a cornfield and you have a tractor, like a gene codes for a protein that does work. So you have a tractor that does work in the field. Now, you bought 5 more tractors of the same model, same brand, everything. Do you have more tractors that can do more work and that is now more efficient in that field? Yes, because it's an increase in the amount of work being done. That is what happens when you have gene duplication. What happens is you have a gene producing a protein product or an enzyme, and it does a specific job. Then you have a gene duplication, and what happens is you have more of that product being produced, and now the whatever organism is more efficient at breaking down or building up whatever thing that protein does. It's now more efficient because it has more protein products being produced. And in addition, you have more protein-protein interactions because you have more biochemical pathways because you have more proteins. So, and then you have more biochemical potential for change. For example, that's why you have all this change in Brassica oleracea where you have cabbages and kale and broccoli, they look very different. And that's because they had a lot of polyploidy going on while they were being selected for. So they had the ability to change. Other plants, we farmers have been cultivating for years, and they don't change that much because they don't have as much genetic potential because they didn't go through any recent polyploidy for that. Corn, for example, they went through a recent polyploidy as well, but not as much as Brassica oleracea. So they changed, but not as much as right. So corn was able to change from the maize to the corn in a very short period of time because they have when they have the gene duplication, you have more genetic potential. You have more genetic material to work with. You have more protein or gene interactions. And well, I don't know if that counts as new information. I don't know what new information really is or what it would look like if I see it, but it counts as an increase in functional information. So you have 100 genes that does a function, and you duplicate that, you have 200 genes that now does the function twice as much.
Yeah, but it's the same function. It's just double speed. How is that constitute? See, I guess that this is the issue in as we are diving into this now a little bit deeper is I talk to evolutionists often, including PhD evolutionists, and this is the sticking point: is you have to believe, and I would think you're the same way. You would have to believe that to go from the single, what evolutionists would call a simple cell. I don't believe a single cell is simple, but they would say you have to go to a simple cell billions of years ago. But to go from that single simple cell to all the complex life we have today, you had to have had new genetic information, new functional genetic information added to the genome. Not just a duplication of something that's already there, new information. To go from a single cell, eventually you have to have all the cells that make up hands, and all the cells that make up feet, and all the cells that make up the internal organs, and all the linings that go along with all the organs, and all the functional pathways that go, and all the chemical pathways. I mean, I could talk forever in all the things that have to come into play and have to be added to a genome. And this is the thing: is that what mechanism do scientists have today? Not gene duplication, because that's not new information. What mechanism is there to show that new information can be added to a genome? Because as far as we know in science, actual science, is that the only information that's there is already there. And that we have something called genetic entropy that occurs over time, where there's new genetic, not information, but mutations and loss of information over time, right? I mean, our generation has 50 to 100 more permanent mutations in our human genome than our parents did. And our kids 50 to 100 more. And as time goes on, we don't even know if that's linear, if that's a sorry, I just lost the term right now. But we're not sure how fast of a rate that's actually occurring at as time goes on. So exponential is the word. So we don't know if it's linear or exponential. And so this would be the issue. And I see somebody here saying there's no such thing as genetic entropy. It's a creationist myth. That's not true. Secular scientists have many research papers talking about genetic entropy. There's lots of scientific research that can be pulled up. We as creationists use it because everybody acknowledges that that's a problem, which seems to be the exact opposite of evolution. So I guess my question to you, Mikie, is that where does the new information come from? Because the only thing I ever hear from PhD evolutionists is they say, well, it has to come through mutations. And I would agree. It's the only way you can add them in. The problem is that there's never been a mutation ever discovered that has increased functional genetic information. That's put more new functional information in the genome. So where do you propose that comes from? Because again, when I made the argument about the Earth, you believing the Earth being billions of years old, the reason why I think it is significant is because we're looking at, yes, the same data that can't talk to us. We have to test the data that's alive. And you guys would be testing data. You'd be testing live animals today, never seeing what a creationist would say a kind turns into another kind. And all you do is have a fossil record that you're trying to put together and to give you an idea of this secular evolutionary hypothesis. So I know I'm throwing a lot at you, but where does the new information come from? Let me start there.
Okay, so new info, quote unquote, new information. Let me just start off. Evolution is defined as descent with modification. It's a modification process. So any new gene or whatever or trait is always a modified version of something else. So evolution doesn't actually add parts; it just modifies them. So the new information, well, you can get more genetic material by duplication, and then you modify via mutation. So there is a process known as neofunctionalization or subfunctionalization of a duplicated gene. So when a gene duplicates, the original copy retains its original function, and the duplicated copy could either do the same thing as its original, or it's free to change because it's not as susceptible to mutations as the original copy. So it can change and acquire new functions, and that's actually been observed many times in fruit flies and dogs, in name the species. Neofunctionalization happens. Now, my question would be because I don't really know what new information is or what it would look like, even if I see it. So the question would be, what is new information, and how would it be distinguished from modified information in a genome? So what would new information look like if you see it? What exactly would it look like? And maybe another question would be, for example, let's say we have an organism. We have a model organism, and a scientist or God himself came down and inserted a gene into that genome. So he designed the gene and he inserted it into the genome, right? But it just so happened that the gene is kind of similar to an already existing gene, but it doesn't matter. It was designed and inserted. Now, that model organism went through, we have one lineage where the design gene was inserted, and then we have another lineage where we had a gene duplication with neofunctionalization, where the new function is exactly or very similar to the design gene. So what would be the difference between a gene that was designed and inserted into a genome as opposed to a gene that was duplicated and modified to perform the same function as the design gene? Yeah, so pretty much I want to know, what would new information look like if I come across it in a genome? And how would I distinguish it from modified information?
See, this is a great question. This gets the nuts and bolts of it, because when you brought up the idea of the fruit flies, right? We can put them through many generations really fast, right? And so we can see changes occur within the species. We can see speciation occur to a degree within the fruit flies. My argument is that the reason why we're seeing speciation occur is not because new information is somehow being injected into the genome. It's that information was already there, and it's been there since God originally created that kind. And through epigenetics, through and environmental factors and sensors within the organism, there are genes that are already present. There are characteristics already present that are being either switched on or switched off, allowing certain traits to be expressed. So while a secular scientist would look at it and say, look, it looks like there's new functional information because there's a new function that this thing has, and we would say, no, it was there all along, and it's environmental factors that cause it to be expressed. And so we look at Darwin's finches, and Darwin's finches, we have research now to show, and we've had it for years to show, that a bird can change its beak size and thickness in its own lifetime. It doesn't need to have this evolutionary thing over years and many generations. It can happen with its own lifetime. Why? Because as it's detecting changes in the environment, you can have genes expressed that causes the beak to thicken or to lengthen. We've seen that, and so much so that those genes that are turned off and on can actually be passed to the next generation. So we have that evidence out there already. And again, it comes back to, though, the information was already present. So when it comes to secular science who believes in evolution, they don't believe that was there in the beginning, right? You have to believe that the information was added in, and this is how. So you asked me, give an example. Here's an example. If you start with a single cell that every secular evolutionist has to start with, right? Pond scum somehow rises what I would call millions of pieces that were specifically designed, would have had to have happened all at the exact same time in the exact same place, coalesce together, and somehow have the ability to come into a cell that can reproduce, eat, give up waste, live, that kind of stuff. But how does that cell that they believe came together develop a heart that the human being has, or that many other animals, that many animals have? How is it that that cell eventually developed an opposable thumb? How is it that that cell eventually developed, and fill in the blank, right? Because there are probably billions of different cells that we have that would be different from the original cell that secular evolutionists want to go back to. And so for that to happen, you have to have lots of information added to the genome. Now, I brought up the example of the humans and the chimpanzees earlier. There's a reason why I did this, because I think this is a great example. Now, depending on the research, some people say that the common ancestor of a human and a chimpanzee, which is considered our closest living relative, right? That our closest ancestor would have been somewhere between 1 and 2 million years ago, where we would have had the split. I've seen some research that goes back 10 million years. Either way, it doesn't matter. We'll use 1 million years for simplicity's sake. We know now, this is in my book. I've said this on the show before, but I want people to hear this, is that evolutionary scientists believe that the human and chimp genomes are somewhere between 98 and 99.2% similar. That's not true. That is the hot zones where they've tried to line up both a human and chimp genome. They've tried to line them up, and within the areas that seem to be most similar, they go into what's called the hot zones, which are the areas that seem the most similar within the ones that are most similar. And within some of those hot zone regions, you would see the 98 to 99%. The reality is overall in the genome, the number is closer to 80 to 82% similar, which means that with the amount of genes in our genome, there would be somewhere around 450 to 750, 800 million base pair differences. These would have to be point mutations. According to all secular evidence, secular evolutionary literature, you'd have to have at a minimum 450 million point mutations to go from a human to chimpanzee. If I cut that difference in half, right, because we're going to go back to the common ancestor, right? So we're just going to take it in half. We're going to say that from a common ancestor of us and a chimp to us today, you would need somewhere around 225 million at a minimum base pair changes, base pair differences between us. How does that occur in less than 1 to 2 million years? Now, I've already said there's no mechanism. There's not a single scientific mechanism today that adds new information to the genome. But even if there was, how do you go in a million years? You have 225 million base pair differences. That literally means you have to have 225 point mutations every year that are all upwards, right? Improvements, or however you want to call it, but that have to go upwards from our common ancestor to a human being. That's literally impossible for that to have occurred. And if that occurred, for that to occur, that means that for every chimpanzee fossil I find in the fossil record, and for every human fossil I find in the fossil record, knowing that there's at a minimum 225 million differences between us and a common ancestor and them and a common ancestor, we have to add those back together again, 450 million. There should be literally just on average, statistically, 450 million fossils of intermediate fossils, transitional fossils, that would be somewhere between the common ancestor and a chimpanzee, or a common ancestor and a human. So let's add the numbers higher. If there's 10 human beings in the fossil record and 10 human beings in chimpanzees in the fossil record, you now have to multiply that number by 10. There should be literally 4.5 billion transitional fossils in the fossil record. Now, we know that there's been way more humans in the fossil record. There's way more chimpanzees in the fossil record. And I'm just saying, if I'm looking at the fossil record, I shouldn't just have 4 or 5 or 6, what some scientists call transitional species. We would, by the way, disagree with that as creationists. We should have trillions of them. We should be tripping over them every time we walk outside our front door, and just literally tripping over these fossils. They should be everywhere, but they're not. we have people again in the same vein of information, and we could talk about information probably different nights if you want to come back, because the information is a whole different ball game. But every time we go to a zoo, I see that the chicken is supposedly a common ancestor. I'm sorry, the Tyrannosaurus Rex is the ancestor of a modern day chicken. So you go to the bird cages, the aviary cages in zoos in America, and they'll say this is the modern descendant of dinosaurs, specifically, T-Rex or that type of dinosaur. And we would say, okay, where's all the transitional fossils that would lead from a dinosaur to a chicken? Because there's got to be trillions of these in the fossil record as well. But they're not there. Oh, by the way, where did the dinosaurs come from? How did the dinosaurs just all of a sudden appear within the fossil record as complex organisms, but there's no precursors to them? There should be billions of years of them, right? And this just compounds to the problems of, and I know I see Kekaro there, T-Rex and birds do share a common ancestor. I'm not sure where. I mean, secular scientists say that there is a common ancestor, but you can't test that, right? That this is not something you can actually test through the scientific method. So you just have to come up with ideas of how you think this happened. And I agree, Kekaro, they don't just appear. You're right. We as creationists would say this: the reason why we have all kinds of complex organisms all over the world, by the way, they're all buried in sedimentary layers. Why would that be? Well, because about 4,300 years ago, God wiped all the life off the face of the earth, but for what was on the ark. And therefore, we have lots of complex organisms buried all over the earth in sedimentary layers. And this is why when you go down to the bottom of the Grand Canyon through all these sedimentary layers, and you get down to that bottom layer, what we call the base layer, there's nothing. A couple of very simple organisms. And there's no transitions anywhere in there. So this, I guess this is where I'm coming at with this, and why, I'm glad you're on for this discussion so we can continue to work through this. But that's what I mean by information.
All right. So what I'll do is tell you, try to make it in point form instead of making 10, 20 points. I wouldn't be able to answer all of them. You're asking about, for example, where does new structures come from, hands and limbs and whatever. And you were saying the information needs to be added. I guess a structure needs to be added, like how you would add parts to a car. Evolution, again, evolution is a modification process. It could never add a structure. It's only modifying existing structures over and over again in different proportions, different size, different shapes, and whatever. It can't add structures. It never does. So, for example, if you look at Brassica, in Brassica oleracea, as I showed you, the wild mustard, the flowers, they're not conjoined. They're separated and they behave like normal flowers. But when you come to things like broccoli and cauliflower, and more specifically the Romanesco bloom, the flowers then coalesce into one structure, into one, and then form a new structure. And this is the same thing we see, for example, in pineapples, where a pineapple is in fact a modified cluster of flowers. In fact, all fruits are modified flowers. That's what they are. They're just either the flower swells in a specific way, or it fuses into one structure. And that's pretty much how the process goes. You never add a structure. Evolution never adds any structure. It's a modification from single cell where you get to multicellularity, and then you get cell differentiation so you can produce different tissue types. And then you change the shape and the proportion of those cells, but you never add a structure. It can't add structures. It's a modification process. So if you're asking for evolution to add a structure, you're not asking for evidence of evolution. You're asking for evidence of something else. Now you're talking about the differences between humans and chimps in terms of they have so many differences, and it can't be more than 80-something% difference. Now I do have a challenge on my channel, which is the onion DNA similarity test, whereby I ask, how do you measure DNA to begin with? Because it's not just a basic, I'm going to just clash two DNA sequences together and measure them. You have to take into account that duplications take place. So for example, let's say we have a gene sequence or a DNA sequence that's 1 billion letters long. and we have a duplication of that. Do we count that as one difference, or do we count that as 1 billion differences? And that's the point. It's very difficult to answer that question straightforward because it is a billion differences and one difference at the same time. So then you have to try to find a way in how you can, compare these DNA similarities, compare these two structures of DNA. So it's not for creationists to just say, okay, the evolutionist method of measuring DNA is somehow fundamentally flawed. Is for you yourself to come up with a method of measuring DNA. Because, for example, if you do that within Brassica, the same thing, even between tigers and lions. Tigers and lions have a 95% DNA similarity, but that was done by the quote-unquote evolutionist method. If you want to do your method, you would get a different result. So whatever argument you're making, that's fine, but you need to propose a method of measuring DNA that we can replace with what you think is fundamentally flawed. So you just can't say, oh, the evolutionist method is flawed, and then leave it at that. We have to come up with a method. You have to come up with a method yourself. So now I've seen, for example, what's his name? Not Todd Wood. He is I think he is a geneticist at AIG. I think at Creation.com. He was arguing the same thing about humans and chimps. I think Nathaniel Jensen was arguing the same thing, that humans and chimps can't be that similar and whatever. Fine, let's throw out the evolutionist method. What method are you proposing then do we use to measure DNA? How do we measure sequences that are duplicated? Do we measure it as one change or billions of changes? Also, you're talking about the differences between humans and apes as if it was not just point mutations, because there was a myriad of different mutations. There are mutations that can add, mutations that delete, mutations that shift, mutations, there are insertions. You can have viral insertions that insert bits of their DNA into the host. So you can have that as well. We do have a lot of retroviral sequences. And that also contributes to the genome size of the organism. You can have horizontal gene transfer from the food you eat. You actually, there's a small fraction of your DNA that is from the plants you consume. It actually happens. So it's not just point mutations. It's it's a myriad of different things that's taking place. And if you're making an argument against the similarities between humans and chimps, it must be applicable. That's the same thing I was talking about. Creationist arguments, they are sound, but they're not applicable. How do I then apply your argument between tigers and lions, who have a DNA similarity of 95%, as done by the evolutionists? What else you were talking about? I forgot. But basically, what I really want to boil down to is, oh yes, so you said we require millions and billions of fossils. Why? Why do we require billions and billions of fossils? For example, we have, again, the same creationist literature. Todd Wood and company, they did a biomineralogical analysis on 19 equid fossils, equine or horse fossils from Eohippus, not Eohippus, but I think Horacotherium, all the way up to the modern horse. And they concluded that this is a single monobaramin, which means that they're a single kind. But there was only 19 fossils in the sequence that he used. He didn't use millions of sequences from Horacotherium to the modern horse. The fossils that he had was enough to perform the analysis. So again, if you're asking for evidence for evolution of that caliber, you must also ask for it in creation when we talk about diversity between kinds. So for example, where are the billions of kinds between tigers and lions or tigers and house cats? There are no billions of intermediates. The evidence we have for them, the similarities we have between them, is enough to warrant the relatedness. So if you have an argument, if you're making an argument against evolution, especially when it comes to biodiversity, it must be applicable both on your side and the evolutionist side. So again, I don't have a problem with the argument. The argument is good, that in reality, there was millions of intermediates, but of course, due to the fossilization process, not everything would be fossilized, and we wouldn't find everything that's fossilized. So you wouldn't have every intermediate. But if you're making an argument against evolution and say we require millions of fossils to show that these two things are related, then you must also apply to creationism to say we need millions of fossils to show that humans are related to Neanderthals or Neanderthals to Homo erectus and so on. So whatever argument you're applying or you're making must be applicable. That's my problem. The arguments are not bad. but they have no application.
So I'll make them applicable for you then. And thank you for that for those points. So first of all, I would say this: it's the evolutionists who have put the sequences of a human sequence and a chimp sequence side by side, and they were the ones that came up with the 98 to 99% similarity. We took that exact same layout and said, wait a minute, you guys are cheating the numbers. You're only looking at specific sections that seem to match up the best. When you look at it overall, it's nowhere near the 98 to 99%. It's somewhere in the low 80%.
Sorry for interrupting. I want to know if that same method that Tompkins used, if you use it on any other species, between any two pairs of species that you already accept are related. He only did that between humans and chimps. Again, the argument is sound, but is not applied to other species. So I'm interested in where it applies.
Yes.
Its application, not just I did it between humans and chimps and I got an argument that I like. Apply it to species you accept are related. So that's why I have an onion test where you do it on onions, where one onion has a genome size of about 6 billion base pairs, and the other one has a genome size of 30 odd base pair, 30 billion base pairs. So it's like almost 5 times larger. How would you measure these DNA sequences? What similarity would you get using your method? And would you say that these two obviously related onions are unrelated because they just have different genome sizes? Or would you acknowledge that polyploidy is a real thing and you have to take that into account, that if a genome duplicates, you don't count it as a billion changes, you just count it as one?
Yeah. And so when we want to make sure the starting points are right. So we as creationists who believe the Bible, so Christians who believe the Bible, we would say that humankind is created separate from every other kind. We aren't related to chimps. We don't come from common ancestors of chimps. We're not ape-like. We don't have any of that stuff. We were made in the image of God as the humankind. We are different than every other kind. So we're not even trying to make the argument that we have some type of similarity to chimps. All we're saying is using what evolutionists use as evidence. We say, wait a minute, you guys are not actually being truthful about this. It's really 85%. If you're going to try to compare them. Now, we wouldn't say that I'm 85% chimpanzee. I don't think that at all. I think that we are made to be humans and God made chimps to be chimps, and that for whatever reason, there are some likenesses between us. And that's all it is. We have a common designer, right? And I know you know that argument about the common designer.
Right. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
I do understand the argument of common design. It makes sense, but it has no application. How do I distinguish common design apart from common descent? How do I identify the descendants of an original design without contradicting myself in the process? So, for example, would I say that all crustaceans are of the same kind or of a common descent, or did God create multiple versions of crustaceans for some reason? I don't know. Did he create every species of palm tree? Or did he create one palm tree that then diversified into all the palm trees? So, and then what happens is common design is indistinguishable from common descent. And there is another thing about common design where is that there is no way you can prove it wrong. And you can't really test it per se. One, you can't test it, and two, you can't prove it wrong. And then the thing is, as I said, it's indistinguishable from common descent because common descent predicts that we would find certain things in nature and in the way we would find it. And it also predicted what we would never find in nature because evolution can't produce such a thing. So, for example, you would never find a mammal or a vertebrate with a mollusk-style eye, right? So the eye would always remain because it inherited a vertebrate eye, they would always have vertebrate eyes. It can have variations on that template, but it can never have like a mollusk eye where the retina is at the back, the optic nerve is at the back of the retina. That's a totally different construction. Now, for a common designer, that is totally applicable. A designer could do that because he's not restricted by principles of evolution. So, for example, you can have 3 models of cars, and they can have different headlights. The same model of cars, the same designer, but they can put different headlights on them. Like, for example, one can have using incandescent light bulbs, one could be using fluorescent light bulbs, and one using LEDs, because they're not restricted by any principles of phylogeny. If we ever see that in nature, ever seeing like a vertebrate with compound eyes, or an insect or a arthropod with vertebrate-style eyes, or maybe an arthropod with a vertebrate-style inner air system, or a tree that has hemoglobin, or animals with cellulose walls in its cells, that would show that that animal could not have been produced by Darwinian means, because it would falsify the principles of phylogeny and common descent. So the mere fact that we don't see these things in nature is evidence against the common design argument.
Yeah. So one thing I want to make sure we're not doing is talking past one another, because again, the issue comes into play what our starting points are. So you brought up lions and tigers. I have no problems with lions and tigers being both within the feline kind. They can mate and have progeny, right? So we believe that they're in the same created kind. I'm not worried about the difference in terms of genetics between a lion and a tiger so much as I'm worried about, can they, with animals alive today, can they reproduce? If they can, then they are within the same created kind. I only bring up the genetics issue between humans and chimps because this is an evolutionist argument, and it's really easy to show how it's a bad argument, because they've actually toyed with it to try to make it look like it's 98 to 99%, and it's not. It's in the low 80 percentile. Again, not saying that we have a common ancestor with a chimp. I don't believe that at all. I'm just saying this is an evolutionist argument, and I'm saying, look, let's let the evolutionists use this argument. Let's show the fallacy of it by showing that there's 450 million base pair differences, that it would be impossible for this to have occurred anyway. If you give the evidence, you look for the evidence that should be there in terms of a fossil record, in terms of the amount of time that they say would have passed since we would have split from our common ancestor several million years ago, and so on and so forth. So when you talk about differences, and you talk about in the onion, is it one difference or 1 billion? The issue is not so much it's not so much the same genes that are copied and put back into the genome. I'm not worried about that. That's just because it doubles its function doesn't make it a new function. It just means there's more output to it. So my biggest issue goes back to what I was originally saying. I'm not expecting a single cell, to all of a sudden reproduce, and all of a sudden there's a huge human heart sitting within the cell. I don't believe that at all. What I'm saying is that for an evolutionist to be consistent with their hypothesis of evolution, you have to have a stepwise approach that would have occurred from the single cell. Something would have had to develop that ended up becoming a heart. It would have taken millions of changes, billions of changes from that original cell. And as you said, you'll have differentiation and different things, but ultimately you have to have new information put in that single cell for any heart to develop, let alone the 4-chambered specialized heart that human beings have, right? This is what I would say is literally impossible to occur. And so I have to go back to the new information thing. Actually, human beings have a decent share with watermelons. So thanks, Andrew, for posting that a few times now. Anthony's 80% watermelon is what the screen just said. So the issue comes back to, Mikie, where does the new genetic information come from? So I'm not concerned about an onion turning into another type of onion. Fine by me. I have no problems with the different onions being within the same created kind that speciate slightly differently based on the genes that are already there. So if gene duplication occurs, whether it's one gene or many genes, I have no problem with that. It's still within the same created kind, and it's the same information that's there. It just got recombined, or it got, like you said, duplicated. What I'm looking for is, how do you go from a single cell to the complex machines we see today, the complex organisms that we see today. And I just use heart as an example. But I mean, we could talk about this with any specialized tissue of the human body, of whales, of tigers, of plants, right? Plants have very specialized cells. I'm not going to say I've studied those as much as animals, but you had to have new information, lots of it added into the genome. And this is what I'm asking you, because I know you're giving some examples, but I will tell you, every single PhD evolutionist I've ever talked to on this, which is a lot of them, they've all acknowledged the same thing. They've admitted the same thing, that there is no known mutation that adds new functional genetic information into a genome. There's none. In fact, mutations only seem to remove information. Some just so happens to be beneficial, right? Sometimes a loss of information can prove to be beneficial in a limited scope, limited environment. We see this with antibiotic resistant bacteria. We see this with sickle cell anemia. Those are the two classic examples. But those are few and far between, and again, still a loss of information. So this discussion that we're having tonight really has to come down to, as a creationist, I believe that God created each original kind. And I know you're familiar with the orchard. You know, for those of you who are listening who aren't familiar with the orchard, we would say as creationists, there are different trees along this orchard. There's one tree that would be called the dog kind, and every single dog that has ever been made has come from this tree. Then you've got the next tree, which is the feline kind, and every feline that you could ever have came from this original tree, and so on and so forth, all the way down. Whereas the evolutionists would say, no, we started with a single cell that branched up into this tree, that branched up into all the complex organisms we see today. We have the issue of, we don't believe that a dog's going to turn into a cat, is going to turn into a bird, is going to turn into a whale, is going to turn any of that stuff.
Oh,
any of that
okay.
would.
Okay, so I just understand what you mean by a change in kind. So apparently you're looking for an organism to diversify into an already existing organism, like a dog turning into a cat, or a cat turning into whatever.
Yeah, not quite. So let me explain my just the result of it would be having two diverse animals that can't reproduce, that would be that far off. So let's even forget about dogs and cats. Let's go back to a whale and a dog, or a zebra and a whale. How would you get these two animals? I don't believe that you could go back in their history and come back to a common ancestor, to which that common ancestor would, in one branch, lead to a whale, and another branch lead to a dog. That's something that we would say would never happen. We would say that there are certain changes that can occur within a created kind, but that you'll never have a created kind form into another created kind. So in that sense, we have a dog kind, we have a cat kind, we have a bird kind, we have lots of different kinds. I would say that there is no new kind that would be developed, no new trees added to the orchard, so to speak, as time goes on. That every microevolutionary change, every adaptive change that would ever occur, that dog will always remain a dog that can reproduce with the other dogs within the dog kind. Does that help clarify more?
No, because it's the same definition you gave before of a kind. And the thing is, when you're dealing with evolution, if you're asking for evidence of evolution, you'd need to ask for evidence of evolution and not what you think evolution is or what it does. Evolution doesn't produce new branches that somehow are disconnected from the original. They would always remain rooted to the parent clade. So dogs would forever remain dogs, even if dogs grow wings or become like whales or become like whatever they become like. They would always remain dogs because they are rooted to the clade they came from. It's like a tree. Every twig remains rooted to the branch which it came from. Even though many twigs may come from it, it remains rooted to that branch, and that branch remains rooted to the other branch, and so on. So it never becomes unrooted. It always remains rooted to the original clade. So if you're asking for like something to somehow delineate from its original clade, that would never happen because evolution doesn't propose that or predict that or support that. The thing about kinds is that, for example, you said feline kind, but how do you distinguish, for example, felines from Felidae, which would be Felidae, from Barbaridae or Nymphoridae or Viveridae, which are very cat-like? For example, you have the saber-toothed cats are not within Felidae. They're not even cats. They just look like cats, but they're not actual cats. But some creationists actually group them together as cats because they look like cats, right? But and that's the thing, is that the differences within a kind is sometimes even greater than the differences between them, whereby you can have different kinds of bats, where you can have one kind of bat and another kind of bat. Well, I don't see what's the limiting factor that's causing two kinds of bats to not be related, or why alligators and crocodiles must be a different kind, or why we'd have different kinds of turtles or different kinds of crustaceans. It makes no sense. And given the kind of variation creationists already accept within kinds, which would diversify way beyond the point of interbreeding. For example, we have the family Poaceae, the grass kind, where you have bamboo, corn, and grass, wheat, rice. All these things are within the same grass kind as proposed by creationists. So we see all that diversity within a kind, and for some reason, the differences between an alligator and a crocodile is somehow too much of a bridge to cross. So they have to be in different kinds. And that's the point I'm trying to make, is that the variation within kinds is usually greater than the differences between kinds, and there is no reason, there is no limiting factor as to why two kinds can't just be the same kind. Why can't we just have a bat kind as opposed to different kinds of bats, or have felines be a different kind to Barbaridae, which look very much like cats, and Viveridae, which look very much like cats, and Nymphoridae, which again, very much like cats. And some creationists do classify them as such when you discuss with them randomly. But the professional barmenologists, they separate them because there is some kind of, I guess, morphological discontinuity between them. I don't know. But yeah, it's not consistent, because, for example, you have the entire order Proboscidea, where you have elephants and then other families of elephants, well, not elephant, but mastodons within the same kind. And then on the other side, you would have like, what I was going to say, you have, I understand that there are separate kinds of animals, but the differences between one kind and the kind closest to it, I don't see the reason why that should even be considered as something to, to make them different kinds. I don't see why an alligator needs to be a different kind from a crocodile, given the diversity you already accept within kinds.
Yeah. So I'll answer you, and then I think we're getting to a point in the show that we want to bring some other people in to ask us some questions as well through this. So this is, I guess this is the best way I can explain it. In the Bible, we have God creating different kinds. All of the genetic information needed in order for the different species, right, for speciation to occur. So we have the original dog kind. We think it was closely related to the wolves of today. The genes, there is so much genetic information in those wolves that through time, through epigenetics, that we got speciation, and that all the different dogs have speciated from that original kind, from information that was already present. So we take what's called a top-down approach. We have lots of information within the original kind, and then as time goes on, some information is lost, some information is just suppressed, some is brought out or expressed, and so through that we have different types of dogs that come about in this adaptation or speciation. That's where we come from. So it's, again, top down. All the information there at the beginning, then all the information was there again at the Ark, Noah's Ark, about 4,300 years ago, and from there we get speciation. So the information that is being expressed, what you would call natural selection, the information that's being expressed or suppressed is already present. We don't have to account for it at any point in the process of speciation, because the information was already there by God. The evolutionist, on the other hand, has to say, we started with very little genetic information in this single simple cell. To go from the single simple cell to all the animals and plants that developed over the billions of years to what we see today, which is all the complex animals and complex plants that we see. You had to have lots of new information put into the genome so that single cell has bred literally all the unbelievable life we see today, from bombardier beetles that shoot fire out their rear ends to plants to different types of animals, right? All this other.
So
That's the issue. Is that it's an information issue, and there's no
Right.
new information that evolutionists can account for being injected
So-
over billions of years.
I need to know what new information would look like if I come across it. Let's say a gene was designed. What would a piece of new information look like in a genome? So let's say I have a species, we sequence a genome, and we sequence the genome 10 years later, and something changed. How would we know that is modified information from new information? So I need to know what exactly would constitute new information. What would it look like? Because I don't know what new information looks like. I know what modified information looks like because that's what evolution does. But new information means nothing to me or the biologists who study evolution or biology, because we don't know what it would look like. So if you can say exactly what it would look like, maybe I can try to find one and show you, okay, does this count or does this count? But if you don't give a criteria as to what it would look like, then I don't know. It's the same thing with transitional forms. What do you mean by transitional form? What do you think one should look like? So let me try to find one for you. What do you mean by a change in kind? What would that look like even if it happened? Let me try to find that for you. So you need to give a criteria as, what would constitute a macroevolutionary change, the minimal criteria, right? The base criteria. Don't go molecules to man. That's obviously we won't be able to show that in any real time, but the minimal amount of change, because we have, for example, again, different kinds of bats. Why would the difference between two kinds of bat, would that be a micro change or a macro change? But apparently, according to your definition, the differences between two bat kinds would be macro, although they're still quote unquote bats, because they're different kinds now, and the differences between them would be macro. So for example, would the differences, so let's stick on the information. I'm going too far. What would new information look like? Like if I sequence a genome today and I sequence it a month later and new information came in, what would I be looking at? Would it be looking at, and how would I distinguish it from something that was modified?
Yeah. Well, so I thank you for being honest on this, right? Because you said something there really quickly, and I want to make sure we point this out. There is zero evidence of what we would consider macroevolution, and to be fair, for a secular scientist who has to claim molecules of man evolution, as you just said, there is literally zero evidence of this ever occurring, right? You have to take fossils of years past and somehow put them together to come up with an evolutionary model. But you can't demonstrate this. I mean, you can reproduce dogs all you want, and you'll always get dogs. You can reproduce fleas all you want, and you'll always get fleas. They never turn into something that we creationists would say, there's another actual created kind. That's the issue. And so when you're asking for change, number one is the type of change that you guys require for molecules of man evolution is impossible to observe because not enough time has passed in your worldview, in an evolutionary worldview.
So okay. Sorry about that, but
yeah,
I think my battery is kind of dying, so I'll have to change cellular phones. So you're saying to me, for example, because I have several plant kinds here, for example, are you saying that the differences between, let's say, cucumbers and pumpkins, or cucumbers and watermelons, that doesn't count as a macroevolutionary change? That's still micro, because they're within the same kind, right?
Well, so this is where we would have to do research to find out what can germinate together, right? And so that's a whole different discussion.
Oh, actually, the reason why they're the same kind is because they have grafting compatibility, right? Because I know creationists, when they classify kinds, there are things that they use as demarcations. So they say, okay, this can interbreed, so that's definitely a kind. These two do not really interbreed, so we have to do an investigation here. But we know definitely when something interbreeds, hybridizes, cross-pollinates, or graft, they are related because only closely related organisms do those things. Only closely related plants are compatible because they have to fuse together, and then they can exchange genes, and you can get a plant that is like a mix of both plants when you graft them. So
Yeah.
we have, for example, on Answers in Genesis, where Drotoprotum have, for example, cherries, sour cherries, and peaches together with almonds in the same kind. They're in the same genus Prunus. They can graft because they're closely related. So I don't know if that counts as a macroevolutionary change to you, but to biologists, the differences between cherries and apricots and cherries and almonds are very different enough for one to consider it to be a macroevolutionary event. The same thing we have, for example, with tomatoes and peppers, with eggplants and with tobacco. All these things can graft together because they're related. Now, I don't know if a creationist would consider tomatoes and chili peppers or bell peppers or whatever the pepper. Not all peppers are related, but in close related. But tomatoes and eggplants or tomatoes and peppers being related as a macroevolutionary event. So that's a lot of change. And even, for example, in the grass kind, we have bamboo and corn and sugarcane and all the other grasses, your lawn grass and bamboo, as being in the same kind. This is not my thing. This is the creationist model where they have all these grasses. Well, bamboo is a type of grass, it's a large one. These are a lot of differences. Your lawn grass is very different from bamboos, very different from corns, very different from wheat, but they are all within the same kind. And for some reason, all that change doesn't constitute a macroevolutionary change because they're in the same kind. So we need to know what is the minimal amount of change that would constitute a kind. If all that change does, macroevolution, if all that differences is not macro, then what would be, right? What the least amount of change that would constitute a macroevolutionary change, so I can try to get that and produce that for you. For example, would the differences between onions and garlics count? Because garlics are just modified onions. There's a cluster of onions in a bulb, right? That's literally what it is. Cluster of onions in a bulb, you get a garlic. That's what it is. They can pollinate. They're very close related. They can pollinate and so on. And there are some intermediate species that look halfway between garlics and onions. So would that count as a macroevolutionary change? Apparently not. So then what is the least amount of change that would count? That's what I'm looking for. The least amount of change that would constitute a macroevolutionary event.
Well, see, and I guess this is probably where we're just going to talk past one another, because the definition you keep using for macroevolution is different than the definition that I'm attempting to use here. And so that's why I keep going back to the issue of information. New information, when you graft two plants together, you're not getting new information. That's information that's already present out there. I'm wanting to know how new information got added to a genome that allowed the heart to eventually develop. How eyes, complex eyes with lenses and things that can move, right? For us to be able to see near and distance and amazing things that God designed into our eyes. How would that have come about? Where did the information come from? Right. This is the issue. And you know, without I think that we should probably, if we're gonna do this again, maybe we should be a little bit more pointed in our discussion. But I do want to make sure we bring some people in, because there's been some people really patient wanting to ask some questions, and I know some people that are in the comment section are getting antsy. they want to hear some more stuff. So I'm gonna bring some guys in. I think your friend Andrew Cumming is here. Bring him in. I'm gonna bring Pastor Justin in. I'm gonna bring Tom Bowman. I'm gonna bring Andrew back in. So I guess
Sorry to cut you off. Sorry to cut you off. What I would do is I would change my device. The one I'm on, I have like 5% charge, so I'll just go to the next device and I would come back in. Okay. Sorry about that.
Okay, that's okay.
Okay.
So I guess Andrew Cumming, I know you're in here and you had some questions for us. I don't know if anybody else had any questions for me, or if you guys had questions for Mikie in here. But as maybe we're seeing who has questions, the thing that we have to be really clear on is, and as Mikie comes back on here in a moment, we've seen a constant change in definitions of terms over the years. whether it's transitional fossils, how you define macroevolution, even how you define microevolution and natural selection, these are things that they've changed definitions on for years. I don't even blame Mikie. This is what's being taught in science as they're trying to get past the huge problems of evolution. The biggest one being the new information that has to be put into the genome. And I don't know, maybe you guys know an easier way to say it. I want to know where all the information came from for a heart to develop.
Well, let me put it this way, and this is one of the things that you and I talked about this. We talk about the idea of in evolution, when it comes to what you guys are referring to as micro and macro, you know that I use the terms, what were the scientific terms. Now the secular scientists have accepted what they used to call Christian terms, but general and special evolution. We have seen this issue where you're right, the terms have changed, definitions change. And one of the things that I pick up on is where there really is what I consider a bait and switch is the idea that you have, I can prove micro or special evolution. In other words, small changes. And Anthony, as you had mentioned, that's already within the DNA. The ability to have this change it's a loss of information from let's bring Mikie back in here. When we talk about that view of evolution, the micro level, it's, from one parent to its offspring, it loses information, right? Where general or macro evolution in the broader sense, that requires the gaining of information. And this is where people, like what Mikie was saying, if I can prove the micro that extends to the macro, not really, because they work differently. One is a loss of information, one is a gain of information. You have to have new information enter into the DNA, such as you mentioned, which is, in the chat, I said, can I answer that question? Because I was going to ask, where does a heart come from? Not only do you need a heart, your blood, you need a heart to pump it, you need lungs to give it oxygen, you need a clotting mechanism so you don't bleed out. All these things have to be there at once. They couldn't have evolved one over time. It wouldn't work. And this is what Behe refers to as, I just lost the term, complexity.
Irreducible complexity.
Thank you. Yes, irreducible complexity. And that's the idea of it, is you can't have just one. You have to have the new information complete. You can't have a species that suddenly has male and female parts. And this is why I don't have enough faith or enough blind faith really to be an evolutionist. You have to believe that we went from an asexual being to to bisexual, in the sense you have male and female. And not only do they have to be in the same time, same location, and have all of the parts functioning properly. In other words, you had to have all the male parts and all the female parts. You can't have them partially. And that has to be there for all in each speciation. That's astronomically impossible.
Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. I'll finish with this. So when it comes to the new information, that's what I'm looking for when I say new information. Is we do get new information into DNA. They're called, I'm having sorry. I've been so focused on this paper I was writing. Mutations. So we do see mutations. No one's going to disagree. That is, a mutation is additional information in the DNA. But what we don't see is, and which would be required for general or macroevolution, is mutations that are beneficial and reproducible. The argument that we see for beneficial is, celiac disease, which is only beneficial if you're dealing with malaria.
No. You're talking the sickle cell anemia.
Sickle cell anemia. Thank you. That's not really not beneficial unless you're dealing with malaria. Otherwise, a lot of things aren't reproducible either.
that's a loss of information. That's the whole issue, right? There's a loss of information that causes the biconcave disc hemoglobin to turn into a sickle shape and not be able to carry as much oxygen throughout the body. That's a bad mutation to have. It's a loss of information, unless you're in an area of malaria, right? And that's the issue of a beneficial mutation. Still a loss of information, just so happens to be in a limited environment with a small scope of time.
But for general evolution, you have to have a gaining of information, right? Because the thought is, and look, we as Christians should never be too hard on Darwin for what he wouldn't have known. I mean, DNA was understood at the time, but probably not by Darwin. They didn't have the internet and things like this. So, Darwin didn't understand DNA as far as we know. And so he's looking at a cell, not understanding the complexity of it, not understanding the DNA that it contained. And to him, it seems simple. And he would hypothesize that we would gain more information, gain complexity over time. And that becomes the issue that we see, is as it's gaining that information. And that's what I'd be looking for, Mikie, when I say a gain of information, something new in the DNA that wasn't there before, that didn't come from the parents, and is beneficial and reproducible, because that is what would be required for general evolution.
Okay, so what I'll do is touch on the irreducible complexity first. Now,
Sure.
Irreducible complexity is actually a prediction of evolution, not of Michael Behe. That was way back in 1918. They predicted that systems would become irreducibly complex. So let me explain how that happens. So irreducible complexity is a description of the current state of a system, not its evolutionary history. There was an experiment done on I think it was a ciliate. And what they did in a long-term experiment, there was a bacteria and a ciliate. And what happened is the ciliate engulfed the bacterium, and instead of swallowing it, it started feeding off the bacterial waste as an energy source, to the point where they become obligate, where the bacteria can't survive without the ciliate, and the ciliate can no longer survive without the bacteria. So now they have become irreducibly complex. You can't remove the bacterium again, because it's called endosymbiosis. So you have a process by which the systems merge, and they have merged so much so that they can't unmerge. So they have now become irreducibly complex. So that's what irreducible complexity is. It's something that occurs, it's something that's produced by evolution itself. And that's the reason why Michael Behe is not taken too seriously with his irreducible complexity, because then he allows for some things to be irreducibly complex and others not. And then it's kind of wishy-washy, like what is irreducible? What do you really mean by irreducible complexity? Because we know that these things can happen. For example, you have the evolution of plants and their pollinators. So you have wind-pollinated plants, then you have insects start pollinating plants, and then after a while they lose the ability to pollinate by wind, and then they become obligate on the insects pollinating them. So they become irreducibly complex. So not all plants need insects. They become obligate on insects, so they become irreducibly complex. Same thing with lungs and hearts, for example. You don't need lungs because fish have gills, but there are some fish with gills and lungs. So then what you have with the gills and the lungs, and you lose the gills and you remain with the lungs. So then lungs now are irreducibly complex, but it hasn't always been so. In terms of new information, what I want to ask is, because I talk about losses now, if you have two genes, the same gene, and you lose one, would that be a loss of information? And then the opposite question I want to ask is, if you have a gene and you gain one, why would that not be a gain? Because if losing one is a loss, why not gaining one is a gain? So that's pretty much the question I want to ask you.
Where would you gain it from if it's not from your parents?
Right. So again, how evolution works and what is being proposed is that the information must come from your parents. It's descent with modification. It's not that information just comes from nowhere. That's creationism. So if you're asking for evidence of where information comes from nowhere, no, that doesn't happen. What happens is you can modify existing information to do new stuff. So you can get new biochemical pathways from existing pathways. You get new genes from existing genes. You get new genes from previously non-coding sequences. That actually has been done. Because, for example, there was an experiment where they, for example, creationists talk about the probability of proteins coming about by random chance. It's not chancy, but anyways. So what they did, they tested that.
Hold on, it's not chance, so there's an intelligent design?
No, it's determined by, it's a very complicated chemical processes. So it's not just like things bumping around in a junkyard. It's governed by the principles of chemistry and biochemistry and so on. So it's not like things that happen. Even mutations are not necessarily random. That's
what's meant by chance. I mean, it's interesting, Mikie, like you just gave an explanation. You said, believing that something comes from nothing is creationism. And Anthony threw his hands up because that's evolution.
Exactly.
That's creationism believes that there is a God that created there. It's not from nothing. Evolution is the thinking that everything came from nothing. Now, if you want to get a PhD in astrophysics or physics, you can maybe argue like Stephen Hawking and say nothing is actually something, and people think you're intelligent when you say it. I actually believe nothing is nothing and something is something. And once you start changing the meaning of words, you're making everything meaningless. So for meaningful conversation, nothing is actually nothing. So when we say that everything comes from nothing, it's because in an evolutionary mind, you're saying everything follows from chemical reactions by the laws of chemical reactions. But where'd those laws come from? Where'd the chemicals come from? You see, ultimately, when we work this back, you have to say everything came from nothing. There's only three possibilities, Mikie, to think about. Either the universe always existed, or the universe created itself, or someone or something created it. And now as we take a look at those, the first law of thermodynamics excludes the first option. The universe didn't always exist. Matter and energy had a beginning. So it couldn't be eternal.
Sorry to interrupt. The laws that govern the universe, the laws of physics and so on, they only work within the universe and not outside of it. So the laws of thermodynamics has nothing to do with the origin.
Do you know that to be a fact?
Hold on, I'm curious with that. So you're saying that you believe that there's things outside of the universe?
Yeah, we don't know what could be outside. It could be an outside is a possibility. But anything that poses is pure speculation. Yeah, so I can entertain that argument as speculation, but that's what it is.
Well, hold on. But here's the thing. Now, this is an interesting thing for you to think about. When I say God, you say that's speculation, but it wasn't speculation on your part to accept that there's something outside of the universe and then say is defining everything.
What I said is that anyone that proposes that there is something outside of the universe is speculation. So multiverse or whatever.
I understand that. I understand that.
Gods, whatever. It's all in the spirit of the realm because nothing we can demonstrate or actually prove what's outside there. So I can entertain an argument on God, but I would entertain it as speculation. That's it. Or multiverse or anything.
But yet, the thing, and this is what Pastor Justin's question comes in. You accept that there's something outside of the universe, and you're speculating on that. But you just stated
I didn't accept that anything I said. I don't know if there is something outside, but anything outside is speculation. And again, the laws of the universe, if something is outside there, doesn't necessarily apply to it because the laws are descriptive for the things that happen within and not for whatever might be outside there. So the laws are only for within, not for outside. Right?
Okay. So let me finish what I was saying, then I'm going to ask you a question about chemicals, where they came from, right? So either the first law of thermodynamics proves that that the universe had a beginning, so it couldn't have always existed. Second, the laws of logic show that you can't have something create itself because it would have to first exist. So it violates the second law of logic, which is the law of non-contradiction. You can't have A and not A in the same way at the same time. That leaves you with only one option. Someone or something created the universe. Now, you're saying the universe is following laws of chemical reactions. Stephen Hawking would say it's the law of gravity. Where did these laws come from? Where did the chemicals that you're saying they're following a law, where did these chemicals come from?
Right. So when we say law, we just talk about the way the chemicals behave. The laws are descriptive. We make laws. We actually describe how things behave in laws, but in reality, laws don't actually exist out in the world.
Okay, so
they
let
behave.
me ask my question again. Hold on, let me ask my question. Maybe you didn't hear it. Where do the chemicals come from?
Yeah, chemicals come from the interactions of atoms, different atom arrangements. You can have different chemicals come from that, ultimately. Yeah.
Where do the atoms come from?
Atoms come from the singularity at the Big Bang.
Okay, where did the energy for the Big Bang come from?
That's a malformed question, because then the principles of within the universe doesn't apply to the beginning of it. That's the point I was trying to say.
Correct, and that's and there you have the problem. See, I appreciate that, because you just destroyed your own argument, because your argument requires nothing to have created a singularity, where it's not only mathematically impossible, logically it's impossible, and yet you still believe it. You just destroyed your own argument, whether you recognize it or not, because you have to believe in a magical bang that exploded from nothing into everything. I don't believe in magic.
No, I don't believe in nothingness, like absolute nothingness can't exist. Isn't that some kind of contradiction? So whatever it is,
I agree with you. Mikey, we're agreeing with you, but here's the problem.
What I'm saying is,
let me just mention one thing. When you remove God from the picture, that's why you have absurdity. You're right that it is impossible to have nothing, an absolute nothing. But the energy required for a Big Bang, for a singularity, had a beginning. So it had to be nothing before that. You just agreed that there wasn't nothing. So again, your argumentation is I don't think you're recognizing it, but what's happening in the argumentation you're making is you're demolishing your own argument without realizing it. Because what I think your underlying thing is, you just don't want to believe God exists. You want to say it's speculation. And yet you can't explain these things without him, I should say.
Anyone could make things up, like a comic book character, and ascribe, qualities to them and have them do stuff. Like, for example, Thanos can do whatever he wants with Infinity Stones. It's easy to explain these things, but to demonstrate these things being real is a different story. So yes, someone could explain how God works and what he does, but can you demonstrate that this thing is real other than just making
Can you demonstrate this Big Bang that you're talking about?
Thank you. That's what I was going to ask.
Right. So no, I can't demonstrate it in that
Like
sense.
Thanos.
So it didn't exist.
No, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. So we have to find out now.
So God would exist in the same absolute way that you said the singularity does, correct?
No. See, we're looking. Okay. So we need to find something. We need to find a way to actually test these things, not directly in the way, like actually see the Big Bang, but there are telltale evidence that the Big Bang happened.
No,
right?
there isn't. There's telltale evidence that God created a universe. But when you reject God, anything will make sense to you. You could take a look at, the microwave radiation, the microwave waves, that supposedly prove a Big Bang. And yet on further research, it doesn't prove it after all, because they're not the right levels of what would be expected. And so there's things that people
elaborate on that.
Yeah, I think Anthony probably knows it more. But the ways when they found the radio wave up at Bell Labs, they discovered a radio, the microwave range or wave, and it was proof supposedly of a Big Bang. And yet, if the wave was millions of years, I forget if it's too flat or if it's not flat enough. Anthony probably remembers, because he remembers all those things. But do you remember which way it was?
Well, so this is a whole different discussion, because this is in regards to this goes back to the horizon problem.
Yeah.
And why they're trying to look for these Higgs boson particles, because that's supposed to determine that's supposed to allow them to fudge with the initial what they would call Big Bang, for that to be able to explain the horizon problem, which is the temperature being uniform, and that's what we are measuring with the cosmic background radiation, to be very uniform throughout the universe. That's a whole different discussion. I want to back up for just a moment, because we do have Humbled Clay who asked a question much earlier, and I want to make sure that we answer this. So he asked, is speciation the reason atheists and evolutionists would say that we still have apes and monkeys? No, they would say that we have apes and monkeys still, because we shared a common ancestor who evolved two different ways, and it just so happens that we evolved slightly better than monkeys and apes that evolved differently from the same common ancestor somewhere years ago. So that's where they get that from, which is again very different than how a creationist would view things, where we have no relationship whatsoever to chimpanzee, ape, monkey, or anything else of that sort. The thing I want to back up to, and Andrew, you're kind of getting to this, and Mikie, this is a real sincere question, and really a sincere issue. One of the things that I had asked you on email is if you were a Christian, because I wanted to know kind of what your background was. You said no, your girlfriend was, and I think family members are. And so the thing I want to make sure that you understand about Christianity, and all aside from what we're talking about here tonight with evolution, is that Christianity, the Bible, would say that we are all sinners. So all six of us who are here live right now are sinners. We've broken God's law continuously in our lives, and that because of that, we've broken God's law, who's eternal. We deserve just punishment, which is eternal, which is hell for eternity, right? Where we have to continue to pay the penalty of our sins against the eternal God, and that God, in his grace and mercy, sent his son, Jesus Christ, fully God, fully man, to live the perfect life we're not capable of, go to the cross to die, and through his death, burial, and resurrection, pay the penalty of sin for those who'd repent and believe. And so we all stand here as sinners. And first and foremost, I want to make sure that we at least tell you this, Mikie, is that you're a sinner as much as we are. I'm probably a lot older than you, so it means I'm a worse sinner than you. But that we're having this discussion tonight because evolution has been the number one issue over the years as to why people try to reject the God they know exists. And this is, as Andrew was asking these questions earlier, where do the laws of chemistry and physics come from? In an evolutionary worldview, we have a universe, according to secular science, that came out of nothing, right? Random chemical reactions doing nothing but obeying the laws of nature that were already there. So the laws that you would say that we learn about in our quantum mechanics classes, which I took, with other laws, chemistry and physics are ones I often use when I explain this concept. But these laws, where did they come from? Furthermore, because, right, a random chemical chance universe, where do they come from? Where do you get laws that are actually orderly, where every single time you bang oxygen and hydrogen together, you're going to get either water or hydrogen peroxide, right? Like that just always happens. Why? Why does this occur in what's theoretically called a random chemical chance universe? But let's go even a step further. So you and I are having a logical conversation tonight, right? As much as you might be disagreeing with me, as much as I'm disagreeing with you, I think there's some things we've kind of talked past one another because we can't nail down definitions to be on the same page. But if you're just the product of random chemical chance reactions over billions of years, where do you have an ability to reason? How do you account for your ability to talk? Because the thoughts formulating in your head, the information that's there, the thoughts that you're formulating, your ability to take those thoughts and express them as words and communicate those to all of us here on air. That's the immaterial. That can't be accounted for in a purely materialistic worldview. So while I enjoy talking about genetics and I enjoy, working through some of these things, ultimately we have a bigger problem. And the problem is that we've spent an hour and 55 minutes or so using logic that is immaterial, using our ability to reason, which is immaterial. We're talking about using our ability to use our senses, right? So we have to be able to evaluate the evidences that are out there. That's immaterial. And the list goes on, but all these immaterial things we're utilizing to have this conversation that you can't account for in an evolutionary worldview. You can't account for in a random chemical chance universe over billions of years. And the thing is that the way that Christians can explain the immaterial is by God. He is immaterial. God is how we can explain this. God has an ability to reason. We have that ability to reason. We're made in the image of God. You're made in the image of God, the same God. And I guess where my heart goes is that tonight I'm having a great time talking, but ultimately you're going to die one day. And the thing that you think is just random reactions is not. You have a soul. You're going to face Jesus Christ, and you're going to have to give an accounting for everything you've ever done. And evolution is always used as a way for people to try to explain away God. In the Bible, Romans 1, Psalm 19, Romans 2, and other areas, that the creation is God's evidence to everybody that he exists. So much so that God says people are without excuse based on the evidence in creation. And so naturally we would see hypotheses from guys who are anti-God come up with hypotheses to explain away creation. So that's where we're at tonight is this issue. And ultimately that's what I care about most for you is understanding who God is. So the one that you're talking about here, who you say that is outside the universe or possibly outside the universe, I would surmise is the God that you know exists. And I guess I'll leave it at that for you.
Yeah. And
yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
well, no, because I was going to wrap up the show. So, but go ahead, Mikie. Give you the last word.
Oh, yeah. Well, I guess just to touch on the topic we originally agreed to talk about. I'm not trying to change the definition. I would work with whatever definition you give, but it needs to be something that I can apply. So, for example, I need to know, when I ask what would count as a macroevolutionary event, I need to know what it would be, even if you're not around. So, for example, I can describe what a speciation event may look like. So even if I'm not around, you don't have to come back and ask Mikie, hey, is that a speciation event? No, you know that because I gave you a definition. So if you give me a definition of macroevolution, I can see a big change. I think to myself, is that a macro change? Is that a micro change? Is that new information or whatever? And I go back to the definition you gave because the definition would be applicable as opposed to just trying to give random examples. So that would count. Yeah, that's examples, but that's not a definition. So we need a definition of what would constitute these things, not just pointing out random examples of what you're talking about. Because then the examples themselves are arbitrary. We need something that we can refer to. Okay, so we gave a criteria, so we know this is the criteria. As long as we meet that, that's it. If you don't meet that, that's not it. Asking for new information that doesn't come from the parent, you're not asking for evidence of common descent. You're asking for evidence of something else. So if you're asking for evidence of evolution, that evolution doing something that it never said it does or it cannot do, then I can't support that. I can show you how new structures can come from old structures, where flowers can become fruits, where leaves can become petals in brassica again, or where roots can become tubers in brassica again. But I can't show you where, like things that's coming from not from their ancestors, because that's not how it works. In regards to the origins of the universe and whatever, again, I would entertain an argument. I have no problem entertaining an argument, but at the end of the day, it's all down to a speculative idea that there is a being out there, that somehow there is no limitations applied to him or whatever, just exists in this, whatever heaven would be, whatever it would be described as. And it's fine. I don't argue against it. I don't go around with, plaques and trying to argue against Christianity and God or whatever. I think that's not my place, but I would entertain an argument on it, but I would treat it as what it is.
Well, but Mikie, see, and the thing is, and this is what I tried to show you, you already have to believe that. It's not, you say you'd entertain it, but you have no choice but to accept that God exists. Why? Because as you already said, you can call it speculation all you want, but something had to have created the Big Bang. The Big Bang needed a Big Banger. It didn't create itself. And that. You said that. You were saying, oh, it's outside the universe. Well, there's only one thing that whatever it is you want to say is outside the universe, that's God. Okay? It's the thing that created everything and started it all. And until so you say you want to deal with facts and all, but yet in just the conversations that we've seen, you have backed into our argument over and over and over again and demolished your own argument over and over again. And you don't see it because you're blinded by one thing, I believe. It seems you're blinded by the fact that you don't want to believe God exists. And yet then you're trying to make sense of everything. And you can't unless you start with God. Now, I will say this. I know I was working on a paper while you guys were talking, but for folks, whether on the atheist side, the Christian side, I want folks to notice the way that Mikie and Anthony were discussing things. Okay, there wasn't name calling. There wasn't the insults and things like this. Good conversation, though I think both of them, at least feel that there was some talking past one another. There's some need for clarification on definitions. And Mikie, maybe you can come back in again and we can further the discussion, because I think it was good. And I think that these kind of discussions where you have people actually engaging and trying to engage with what each other's saying, making their points, but trying to clarify the issues, I think that's a good thing. Not the debates we see where people are just screaming at one another, name calling and doing insults. Hence the reason I won't debate Aaron Ra, because he can't do anything besides name calling and insults. So I wanted to use that as an encouragement to folks. I hope that this has been helpful for folks. Mikie, if you want to come back in, any Thursday night, we're here every Thursday night. If we're not doing a formal debate where we don't have participants, anyone can join. Andrew, same for you. You were you were quiet even after you were brought in, but you're welcome anytime. Typically, the way we do the show is we have a topic of discussion, but as people come in and want to ask questions, we'll break from that topic to do that typically. And so anytime you want to come in and further the discussion, we'd be happy to have that discussion. Any one of us, Anthony, Justin, or myself. So I want to thank both Anthony and Mikie for coming in, for Justin for running things kind of behind the scenes. I don't know if, Anthony, is there any closing comments do you and Mikie want to make closing comments or thoughts, or should we just end?
No, we can. Mikie, if you want to go ahead and give some closing thoughts, then I'll.
So what I would close with, again, thanks for acknowledging that we did have, in fact, a respectful debate. I'm not in for the slinging insults and so on. Again, my entire family are Christian. I don't have any malice against Christianity or whatever. So I don't like to argue against that. Again, people have the right to believe and so on. So I think you can believe whatever you like, and that's fine. When it comes to the arguments against evolution that creationists make, again, the arguments themselves on their own, they're fine as arguments, but then they need to be applied to real things. So if you're making arguments against human-chimp DNA similarity, fine, but you have to make it across the board, right? So tigers and lions, same thing, because they have 95% DNA similarity, and they did the same fudging, according to you, that caused that to happen, right? Because they have to exclude DNA sequences to get that 95%. If you do it on tigers and lions, you may get something even less than 70 because it's even more different than humans and chimps. When you make arguments on loss of information, but we have organisms that increase their genome size. Does the increase in genome size count as a loss as well? I don't know, because again, we don't necessarily know exactly what constitutes a loss. I guess gains even counts as loss. I don't know. The idea that information comes not from their parents, that's not something evolution ever proposes or requires to happen. It's a modification process all the way. Structures are not added. Information is not added. It's modified all the way. And then we need a minimal set of criteria that would count as macroevolution, not just some random examples, but criteria as to, okay, this kind of change. So even if we don't see something happening in mammals, let's say we see it happening in arthropods, we'll say, oh yeah, that would fit because he gave the criteria that would apply across the board. So we need argument that can be applicable across the board. And yeah, that's pretty much it. We need arguments that apply, not just make fancy arguments, but make arguments that could be applied.
Anthony?
Yeah. So, yeah, and thank you again, Mikie, for coming on. And it was a very respectful conversation. So it's nice to see that people can do that. I just looked up tigers and lions, and they actually, I haven't found a study as I was looking real quick to see how closely they're related. It does say, though, that tigers and house cats, which we would believe are of the same created kind biblically, that they share, according to secular research, 95.6% of the genome. So pretty close. I probably would believe it's even closer than that. But having said that, I just wanted to throw that out there. This is the fundamental issue. We both acknowledge we cannot observe macroevolution from my definition to occur. We can't observe those wholesale changes that would make both of us happy in defining macroevolution. And that would be necessary in order to define this. And so the issue, though, always comes down to this. And this is the thing I've asked multiple times now and brought up multiple times. I am not talking about modified information. When you say modified information, that's the Christian worldview. That is exactly what we believe. We believe the information that is already present is either expressed or suppressed as speciation occurs. That's what we believe, but it's with information already present. The whole issue with molecules for man evolution is that secular scientists want to just try to look at these little changes because they believe that they can take little changes, it proves the big changes. But even then I say, well, wait a minute. We know that the big changes can't be observed. And this is why you have no evidence for that. But we go to the many changes, and even for those small changes, you have to have new information out of the genome. To go from molecules to man, you have to have new information. There has to be billions and billions of bits of information that are added to a genome. That's what we don't have. It's not there. No mutation has ever shown this. And so that's the part that I want to leave everybody with is no new information added, no new functional genetic information added to the genome. And that itself is the problem. It rips apart the entire evolutionary argument. The fact that genes can recombine, the fact that we have information that is recombined, wonderful. That's exactly what a creationist believes.
So let me close out and just say, I actually agree with Mikie that we have to be consistent, and that is where his argument broke down. Because as even in the short discussion I had with him 2 separate times, folks rewatched this, re-listened to this. You saw that he wasn't consistent. He'll say it's speculation to believe in God, but believe in a Big Bang is absolute. You can see that, and this is the thing when we want to ignore the evidence that's right in front of us. We can see it, and yet given this scenario for Mikie, for you to believe, you won't, because you don't have a evidence problem. You have a spiritual problem. And that's why for you, I do plead for you that the thing most important for you to get out of this discussion was really something that Anthony, mentioned earlier, is that, you and I, Anthony as well, we're going to be judged by God. We're not innocent. We're guilty. We break God's law, and we would rightly deserve eternity in a lake of fire because God is an eternal being, and we're accountable to him. And so because of that, my plea for you is that you turn from trusting yourself as a good person, your good works, stop trusting that there is no God that you're trying to convince yourself of, but instead trust Jesus Christ, God Almighty, who died on the cross as a payment of sin that you can have eternal life. That would be my encouragement to you. I thank you for coming on. I hope you do come back. I think it was great discussion. I think it was good dialogue. And we'll be praying for you down there in Grenada, and welcome you back anytime. And for folks, we appreciate. We of course, as usual, those that are getting regular listeners know that we're getting used to Anthony being on here, and we go over time. But Ethan wanted to kick me out so that this can go for another 2 more hours. I'm gonna rein it in, and we're gonna do the end in a somewhat timely fashion, only 15 minutes over. But I do appreciate humble clay. I'm with Ethan 2 more hours. Well, guys, that's what next week is for. Maybe Mikie will come back. We weren't able to bring Michael in, but he's got to work early in the morning. So maybe next week or so, maybe we'll get him in earlier. But he is an atheist from Canada, and so we'll get him in, hopefully, to get a discussion going as well. So, and that's what this is about, guys. If you have questions, even if you're a Christian and you have questions, this is what Apologetics Live is. We want to teach apologetics. We want to help you in answering difficult questions. So if you have, maybe you are challenged with something, maybe you're going to be challenged with something this week. That's what this is for. That is for you to come in and ask those questions so that we can help you with some of the answers. So until next week, just strive to make today an eternal day for the glory of God. See you.